Legal requirements, legal and other requirements. As a business, you are not just exposed to occupational health and safety risks, you also have exposure to legal risk. As a responsible citizen and a corporate citizen, you are required to comply with the legislation of the environment within which you operate. If you are operating in Botswana, Mozambique, South Africa, you need to comply with that legislation. And you need to understand that legislation. If in South Africa you can walk around and chew gum and speak loudly and throw litter on the streets, and you go to a place like Singapore and you do the same there, you will land up in jail, because there you are not allowed to chew gum in the street, you're not allowed to spit gum out in the street, you're not allowed to litter. All right? And if you get caught with drugs, for instance, in Singapore, you get a death sentence. No arguments, no appeals. So you need to understand the different rules of the different countries. If you go to Saudi Arabia or to the Congo or different provinces in South Africa, different rules and regulations apply. Non-compliance may result in risk of fines, jail time, prosecution, closure, harassment, business loss, and ignorance of the law is no excuse for non-compliance. So you can't say, well, you didn't know that this is the law and that's why you didn't follow the law. That's no excuse. Compliance with all applicable laws is required. National laws, provincial laws, and even municipal bylaws. If you are operating within a municipal area, you need to make sure what those bylaws are so that you can comply with them as well. And your legal exposure is much more than just the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations and the Hazardous Materials Act and all of those kind of things. You need to start looking at from the Constitution all the way to wherever you are working to the municipal bylaws. How do we do this? Well, it's hard work, but every organization needs to review all the legislation that may be applicable to the organization. I'm going to give you an example. Legal risk register, which lists most of the legislation as late as last year. Not necessarily all the COVID regulations. They changed so fast, I couldn't keep up. And what you can do is you can scan through those requirements, and you can ask yourself, this act, is it applicable to me? If you don't know, then you need to go and read it, see what it's all about, and say, yes, it's applicable to me. If it's applicable to you, you need to also answer the question, do I comply? Because if the law is applicable to you for your kind of business that you're doing, you need to comply, otherwise you have the risk of penalties, fines, shutdown, business closure, jail time, and all those things. If it doesn't apply, we put it on ice, and only when my context changes do I go back and I review the legislation that was not applicable to ask myself, is this now applicable to me? I might be engaging in petroleum transport suddenly as a sideline to my business, and I didn't do that before. Now I need to look at hazardous material transport regulations and so on. When you work through the legal requirements, you will pick up that there are certain prescriptions written into the laws. Now, if these laws are applicable to you and it requires that certain people need to be appointed, you might have to appoint people under the construction regulations, you may have to appoint health and safety reps, you may want to appoint a competent person in terms of the occupational health and safety law, which is an engineer, which takes responsibility for certain things. All of those prescriptions come from legislation. So going through your legislation will give you a list of those things, which is the first things that you then need to do in your health and safety management systems, is appoint the people as required by law. There may be inspections required for certain processes or equipment. Vehicles need to be roadworthy, for instance. Certain pieces of equipment needs to go for inspection, like lifting equipment, pressure equipment, and so on. So looking through the legislation will give you a list of the items that require legal inspections, as well as the time frames. There may also be minimum competence levels for certain roles. In other words, a health and safety rep, you can't just appoint him. He has to be trained to work as a health and safety rep. The law also specifies their power, their authority, and their responsibilities, and what they are liable for. There might be minimum specifications for facilities and equipment, HAZChem storage, illumination levels, ventilation levels, temperature exposures, the number of ablutions required, machine guarding required on certain pieces of equipment. The law may even specify certain mandatory meetings, like health and safety committee meetings, that have to take place at a minimum every 3 months, and you need a health and safety committee, which the law specifies how you should compile that. The law also says for dangerous work you need permitting processes, confined spaces, isolation, hot work, and those kind of things. So if your context, if your background, if the services that you are delivering fall into that category and that's applicable to you, your health and safety management system should contain these processes for permitting. This is an example of a health and safety register, just one extract, one or two extracts from a legal register. This lists the legislation. In this case, it's the Environmental Regulations Act for workplaces. Is it applicable to me? Yes. Do I comply? No, my illumination and stuff is not all that great. My ventilation is not right. I don't have eating facilities. So I need to go and look at the requirements, and these are the things that I need to do to become legal, to become legally compliant. I then can give responsibilities and a due date for every one of these items, and that becomes one of the first actions that I need to do in my health and safety management system to comply. Facilities regulations, do they apply? Yes. Am I compliant? No. Well, I need to go and do an audit to make sure where I stand. What is the illumination, ventilation, and all those kind of levels? The OSH Act have got the General Administration Regulations. Do they apply to me? Yes. Do I comply? Let's say no. Well, it says I have to display a copy of the OSH Act. Am I doing that? No. Corrective action, get a copy of the Act and display it. Do I have to elect and appoint health and safety representatives, depending on the number of employees? Have I got incident reporting processes? Do I enforce compliance? Do I have a system where all injuries are reported and are investigated, and so on and so on? Those are all requirements in the law. They are not things that health and safety managers think out. So you can only know these things if you go and do a legal risk assessment for your organization. Like I said, legislation often prescribes the minimum requirements to deal with issues, hazards, threats, and it's really a good source of the minimum controls that you need to apply in your organization to keep people safe. Health and safety legislation has been written on tough experience. It's been written on there's the old cliche where they say health and safety legislation has been written with the blood of other people. But it is true, because people had to get hurt and injured for us to realize that people are not necessarily managing these things out of their own free will, and then we have to create legislation to force people to do this. I can also use the risk assessment matrix, because sometimes when I do my legal assessment, my legal compliance, I realize there are so many things where I don't comply. I can then use my risk matrix. So I can put a requirement or 3 columns next to it, and I can say, what are the chances of something related to this legislation going wrong? If it goes wrong, how severe is the consequence? I use my risk matrix and I find a risk rating, and I can then prioritize my actions that I'm going to apply for my legal compliance. You still need to achieve complete legal compliance. You can't say that I'm not going to follow certain laws because the risk is very low. But it's a good way of prioritizing your actions in the beginning when you've got limited resources. And it will be acceptable that that is a reasonable practice should something go wrong before the time. You need to apply constant management to your legal register. You need to keep your ear on the ground in terms of changing legislation, new legislation, amended legislation, and somebody should take care of that. I'm subscribing to a service on the internet where I can get all of that legislation. I will make the links to these services. The government provides you free access to some of the stuff, and I'll give you the links to the service that I'm using to stay up to date with legislation as well.